Cal Becker had always believed that silence was an old friend. Steady, predictable, a companion that never demanded anything from him. But the silence that settled over the woods after Rook's sudden growl felt nothing like the quiet he knew. It was heavier, older, as though every tree had turned its face toward him and held its breath. And Cal, standing rigid on a frost-kissed bed of leaves, felt an instinct that had once saved his life in the desert flare inside his chest, reminding him how quickly the world could shift from ordinary to deadly. Rook, usually alert but calm, had frozen mid-step, muscles coiled so tightly that Cal could hear the faint tremor in the dog's controlled breathing, and when the ranger whispered Rook's name, the dog didn't look back. His eyes remained locked on a dense patch of undergrowth 30 feet ahead, eyes that had sensed danger long before Cal ever could, eyes that didn't lie. Cal followed that stare, squinting into the darkness between the trees, seeing nothing but feeling everything, the wrongness in the air, the strange drop in temperature, the uncanny stillness of animals that should have been rustling or chattering or moving somewhere among the brush. And as he took a cautious step forward, a flood of old training surged through him, unbidden, unstoppable, reminding him of nights spent waiting for an ambush in places where shadows swallowed entire squads without warning. He whispered again, softer, "Easy, boy," but his voice cracked, betraying the tension building in his spine, because Rook didn't ease, didn't shift, didn't blink. The dog's instincts were precise, refined by years beside a man who'd once walked battlefields and later walked forests with the same cautious reverence. And Cal knew with chilling certainty that Rook had just sensed something alive, something watching, something that had been quiet enough to evade both of them until now. Slowly, Cal lowered his hand to the holster on his thigh, not to draw but simply to feel the cold reassurance of the weapon there. And as he inhaled, the scent of the woods hit him differently. Pine, damp soil, and something metallic beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, like the memory of blood long dried. A wind stirred then, but not in a natural way. It moved through the trees as though carrying intention rather than chance, brushing past Cal's face before sweeping around to Rook, who finally shifted one paw forward, not breaking his rigid stance, but committing to the direction of the unseen presence. Cal's heartbeat steadied into a slow, deliberate rhythm, the same rhythm that guided him through firefights, and he spoke to the woods in the steady voice of a man who had survived too much to fear mere imagination. "If someone's out there, show yourself," he murmured, though some quiet part of him hoped no one would answer, because the silence that followed was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something hidden deciding its next move, something that understood patience far better than he did. And as the wind died once more, leaving only the weight of anticipation, Cal felt the first tremor of dread coil around his spine, not because he feared what lurked ahead, but because deep down he knew this moment was the beginning of something that would unravel everything he thought he understood about these woods, about his past, and about the bond he shared with the dog who had never once misread danger. Cal had seen the kind of war that doesn't end when the bullets stop flying, the kind that follows you home, sits with you in the stillness, crawls into your dreams, and poisons your waking hours. And when he'd first walked into that concrete slab shelter, reeking of bleach and despair, he hadn't expected anything to reach him. But there in the corner cage was a black shepherd mix, ribs showing, left ear torn, staring at him with the same tired, unflinching look Cal saw in the mirror each morning. No whine, no bark, just a solemn nod of recognition between two beings too stubborn to lie down and die. And without speaking a word, Cal had signed the papers and walked out with Rook by his side, two survivors bonded by something unspoken. In those first months, neither of them slept through the night. Cal would jolt awake, soaked in sweat, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, while Rook paced endlessly, reacting to sounds that never came, both haunted by ghosts they couldn't name. But over time, through repetition, through silence, through simple acts like shared coffee on the porch at dawn or quiet walks through mist-laced trails, they learned to breathe again. Not all at once, but piece by piece, as if the forest itself was mending what the desert had shattered. Rook, trained by nothing but trauma and time, became more than a companion. He became Cal's compass, grounding him in ways therapy and meds never could. And Cal, once hardened to the point of numbness, found himself talking to the dog like a partner, like a friend, because Rook didn't flinch when Cal's voice cracked or when his hands trembled with the weight of memory. They'd been together 6 years now, a stretch of time stitched together with long silences, shared survival, and the kind of trust only forged through blood and fire. And though the war had ended long ago in the headlines, it lived on in their bones, in their breath, in the choices they made every day to keep moving. Cal didn't talk much to other people. Townsfolk respected his space, said little beyond a nod. But with Rook, everything could be said without words. A glance, a gesture, a tilt of the head. And in this moment, as they stood motionless in the woods beneath that canopy of waiting branches, Cal realized something had changed. Normally his mind would be flickering back to desert sands, to the metallic sting of gunpowder, to the screams he couldn't forget. But here, now, it was different, because the forest had taken hold of his attention, not with nostalgia or dread, but with the pressure of presence, of something now, something here, something watching. And it told him with quiet certainty that whatever they'd just stepped into wasn't a memory or a flashback. It was real, it was moving, and it had already decided they weren't alone. Rook moved like he'd caught the scent of something buried beneath time itself. Low to the ground, muscles taut, his pace quick but controlled, as if every step mattered. And Cal didn't hesitate, his boots pressing into damp earth as branches whipped at his arms, the well-worn trails of his ranger's domain falling away behind him like the chapters of a book suddenly rewritten. He knew these woods, or thought he did, mapped every trail, marked every tree scar, memorized every seasonal shift in wind and moss. But this place was foreign, untouched by park rangers or hikers or even time, it seemed, as though the forest itself had decided to hide this stretch from men. Trees leaned closer here, their limbs gnarled like fingers weaving a net overhead, blocking out what little light the cloud-thick sky allowed through, and the air, once crisp and cool, grew dense, humid, pressed in around his ribs like hands trying to still his breath. Rook didn't slow, didn't wait, didn't even glance back. And that alone told Cal everything he needed to know. His partner had found something, and it wasn't lost deer or a trapped fox. It was something heavier, something that clawed at the animal parts of the brain and made every step forward feel like defiance. The world grew quieter with each footfall. Birds no longer chirped, leaves no longer rustled under wind, and the only sound Cal could hear was the crunch of twigs beneath Rook's paws and the distant thrum of his own pulse hammering against his skull. The ranger's hands itched. He wanted to radio in, mark his GPS, do all the procedural things his training insisted on, but a deeper instinct told him not to break the moment, not to fracture whatever fragile bridge they were crossing by introducing noise into it, because this wasn't a normal search. This wasn't even tracking. It was discovery, the kind that rewrote stories and unearthed truths people had buried because they were easier to forget. Cal's breath came slower now, more controlled, and every footstep felt deliberate, like stepping into a ritual he hadn't meant to start. Ahead, the trees began to change, the bark darker, almost black, not from rot but from something else, like the life had been drawn out of them, and the underbrush thickened unnaturally, thorny vines twisting around one another like veins pumped with secrets. Still, Rook pressed on, weaving through them with surgical precision, and Cal, cutting his way through with the small blade he kept on his belt, felt sweat bead at the back of his neck despite the chill. Not from exertion, but from knowing they were no longer following a trail, because trails are made by repetition, by the passage of feet over time. And here, not even deer dared pass. It hit him all at once. This was a place untouched by the living, and yet it felt known. Not by him, not by Rook, but by something, and that something had allowed them in not because they were invited, but because it was ready to be seen. The backpack lay half-submerged in the earth, tucked beneath a tangle of roots like a body deliberately hidden from the world, its olive-drab canvas swollen with moisture and half-eaten by moss and mildew. But the second Cal's eyes locked on it, his breath caught, because that shape, that faded color, that frayed corner on the front pouch, it all roared back to him from another lifetime. He knelt without thinking, his knees sinking into the damp soil, fingers trembling as he brushed away the rotting leaves and wet earth. And then there it was, stitched in a thread that had once been black, now a faint ghost of its former self. Harris. Barely legible, almost erased by time, but still there, stubborn, like the man himself had been. And for a long moment Cal just stared, unmoving, heart hammering in his ears as the past surged up like a tidal wave he'd spent 2 decades trying to outrun. Harris had been more than just a squad mate. He'd been the reckless, maddening heartbeat of their unit, the guy who played harmonica during supply runs, who could make you laugh even with mortar shells landing half a mile out, and who, on one searing day outside to crit, vanished in a plume of fire and dust after a roadside ambush that split their convoy like paper. The report had said, presumed KIA, but Cal remembered the way Harris looked at him just before they split that morning, how he slapped Cal's shoulder and said, "If I go, I'm not dying in the sand. I'll haunt the green." And they'd both laughed, because they always joked about death like it was just another shift change. Now, holding that pack in the middle of a forest untouched by maps, Cal couldn't laugh. Not when the truth pressed down on him like a second weight. Because if Harris had made it out, if he'd somehow ended up here, then everything Cal believed about that day, about his own survival, began to crumble beneath his feet. He unzipped the main pouch slowly, bracing for rot or nothingness, but instead found layers. Layers of old gear, waterlogged but intact, and a bundle of papers sealed in a plastic bag, the edges browned, the corners curled inward like they were trying to hide their contents. Rook stood silent beside him, ears back, as if he too understood that what they'd found wasn't just lost property. It was evidence. It was a message, maybe even a warning, and Cal felt the woods close in tighter around them. Not physically, but spiritually, as though they'd crossed an invisible threshold into a story that hadn't wanted to be told. And now that they had, the forest wasn't about to let go easily. Standing slowly, pack in hand, Cal scanned the trees, and for the first time in a long, long time, he wasn't sure what he was looking for, because the dead man they'd left behind 20 years ago wasn't dead, and whatever had happened since, it hadn't been peace, and it hadn't been mercy. The letters were crammed into a plastic sleeve that had long lost its seal, pages swollen and warped, ink bled into rivers that twisted across the paper like veins. But even through the water damage, even through the frantic handwriting, Cal could read enough to feel the air leave his lungs. Harris had always written with sharp, blocky penmanship, clean, precise. But these pages were different, the script jagged, frantic, almost clawed onto the paper, and as Cal unfolded the first sheet, he felt a coldness creep through his fingertips, as though the words themselves carried a temperature. "The Watcher knows my name." The page began. The ink thickened where the pen had pressed too hard, and beneath it were rambling lines about voices moving through branches, about footsteps that didn't belong, about something that lived between the hours of dusk and dawn and had been following him long before he ever stepped onto foreign soil. Flipping through the next letter, Cal found another confession. This one more chaotic. Words crossing over words, sentences colliding, mentions of roots that breathe, of eyes in the bark, of an ancient hunger that wasn't human, wasn't animal, wasn't anything Harris recognized from any world he'd known. And Cal felt the lines blur between delusion and truth in a way that made his stomach twist. He remembered Harris's bright grin, his crude jokes, the way he could calm the unit during the worst nights. But these letters were not written by the man Cal knew. They were written by someone hunted, someone unraveling thread by thread, someone who believed the forest itself was alive and waiting. And as Cal sifted through page after page, each one heavier than the last, the truth pressed against him like a weight he wasn't prepared to bear. Harris hadn't died in Iraq, not physically, not mentally, and the thought that he might have wandered his way back home only to lose himself in these woods was almost too much to comprehend. The letters grew darker as they went on, shifting from warnings to confessions, admissions that he'd stopped trying to escape, that he'd begun listening to the whispers, that he'd followed them deeper because the forest promised answers the war never gave. One page, torn unevenly, contained only a single sentence repeated over and over until the ink bled through the sheet. The watcher sees what men bury. Another read, "He knows what you left behind, Cal." Cal froze when he saw that. His own name, written in letters that shouldn't have known him, shouldn't have known anyone outside a battlefield. 20 years gone, and a chill rippled across his shoulders as Rook let out a low whine, nudging the letters as if trying to pull them away from Cal's trembling hands. How long had Harris been here? Alone, spiraling into madness or dragged toward something older than madness? How many nights had he spent scribbling warnings no one would find? Cal pressed the stack of pages to his chest, closing his eyes for a brief second, because suddenly the forest didn't feel empty anymore. It felt inhabited, aware, as if the very trees had leaned closer to read the letters with him, as if whatever Harris had feared still lingered in the soil. And as he opened his eyes to the looming shadows, Cal understood with bone-deep certainty that Harris hadn't just vanished into the woods. Something in these woods had taken him in. Cal couldn't breathe. Not in any way that felt natural, because the woods around him had begun to hum with memory, and not the kind you recall by choice, but the kind that claws its way up from the pit of your stomach without warning, triggered not by sound or scent, but by a weight in the air, by the way the light slanted wrong between the trees, and in an instant he was no longer in Virginia, but in the blistering furnace of Iraq, the grit of sand in his teeth, the shouts in Arabic rising and folding into the static of radios blaring, boots thudding, the sharp pop of gunfire, and then, boom! An IED shredding the silence and the road beneath their convoy, the scream that followed not his own but Harris's, ragged and animal as he went down, blood pouring from his thigh like the earth itself had opened up to swallow him. Cal remembered crawling toward him, the world tilting and narrowing, the chaos all around them dissolving into that one moment of sheer focus. Get him out! Get him out! Get him out! But there was fire. More shouting, a command to retreat, the kind of order you didn't question unless you wanted to die. And Cal had hesitated, just for a second, Harris's eyes wide and pleading, dirt stuck to his lips, mouth moving in words Cal couldn't hear. And then darkness, a forced march away from the flames, from Harris, from the impossible decision he'd never forgiven himself for. And now, here in this forest, with Rook standing sentinel and the letters still burning in his hands like they carried a curse, Cal felt that same moment pressing down on him all over again, because it wasn't just a memory anymore. It was here. It was stitched into the bark and the soil and the very geometry of these woods, as though this place had drawn Harris to it like a magnet for the broken, the forgotten, the half-dead. And Cal began to wonder for the first time if the war hadn't ended for Harris not because he couldn't let go, but because something had found him. Something older than nation or battle. Something that waited for souls weathered enough to see it. He pressed the heel of his hand to his forehead, trying to slow the images flashing across his mind. Sand turned to ash, cries echoing through trees instead of alleys, the look on Harris's face, not accusing but knowing, the kind of look that says, "You'll carry this longer than I ever will." And it struck Cal with terrifying clarity. If Harris had written Cal's name in those letters, if he had warned of the Watcher, then the past wasn't just echoing through this forest, it was alive. Here, waiting, looping, feeding, and maybe Harris hadn't brought the war home after all. Maybe the war, the real one, the one beneath all the politics and uniforms, had always been waiting here, rooted deep in this soil long before men gave it new names. Rook halted mid-stride, his body tense, nose raised to the windless air, and Cal followed his gaze to where the trees bent unnaturally inward, a clearing choked by brambles and roots that seemed to twist not from growth, but from deliberate concealment, and in the center of it all, barely distinguishable from the forest that had nearly consumed it, stood a cabin, or what could be called one if generosity permitted it, its slanted roof sagging beneath a quilt of moss, its wood planks warped and darkened by time and rot, a crooked chimney leaning like a spine, broken under the weight of silence. And Cal felt something cold settle into his bones, a recognition not of the place, but of the atmosphere it exhaled, like the air had thickened with something unsaid. He approached slowly, Rook flanking him with cautious steps, and as they neared, he could see how the forest had tried to reclaim the structure. Ivy threading through shattered window panes, vines gripping the doorframe like fingers refusing to let go. But the building resisted in the way things touched by obsession often do, stubbornly clinging to its purpose even in decay. The door creaked inward under his touch, revealing a single room swallowed in shadows that swam with dust and memory, and what Cal saw inside didn't hit him all at once. It crept in, piece by piece, assembling a picture more horrifying because of its coherence. A table cluttered with yellowing ration tins stacked in pyramids like relics of a siege. A wall lined with pinned photographs, faces he recognized, neighbors from town, people he'd nodded to in diners and gas stations, caught mid-smile or walking dogs or raking leaves, all captured by a lens that had watched them without their knowing. A pile of maps covered another table, dog-eared and overmarked, trails traced and retraced in red ink, notes scribbled in margins. Moves at dusk, always alone. He knows too much. The words repeating in layers like someone had rewritten them obsessively, not to clarify, but to make them true. And in the center of it all, a chair bolted to the floor, facing a cracked mirror that had been blackened with soot, as if its reflection had become too unbearable to look at. And beneath the chair, a scattering of small bones? Animal, maybe, but stripped too cleanly, too deliberately. And Cal felt his throat tighten as the question formed not in his mind, but in his chest. Was this madness, or was it worship? Because this wasn't just survival, this was ritual, this was planning, and Harris, if this was where he had lived, hadn't been hiding from the world. He'd been studying it, preparing for something only he seemed to understand. And as Cal stepped further in, Rook refused to cross the threshold, letting out a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards, as if the dog sensed that whatever had been born in this place hadn't left. Not entirely, And Cal's eyes locked on a final detail that made his breath hitch. A photograph pinned above all the others, creased and water-damaged, but unmistakably him, standing with Rook at the ranger station, his name scrawled underneath in jagged ink, circled once, then again, and beneath it, just 3 words. He'll find me. Harris emerged from the dark corner of the cabin with a slowness that made Cal's heart seize, as though the man were not stepping forward but being released, peeled from the shadows by something that had held him for far too long. His body was little more than a bundle of bones wrapped in weather-beaten skin, cheekbones sharp enough to cut the air, clothes shredded into rags that clung to him like they, too, were barely hanging on. But it was his eyes. Those eyes Cal remembered as mischievous, alive, stubborn, that now looked fractured, like someone had taken a hammer to glass and left every crack open to the world. And the moment Cal whispered his name, the man smiled with a serenity that felt wrong, stretched too wide, a grin forged not from joy but from revelation. "Cal," he breathed, voice brittle, like dried leaves scraping against bark. "You finally heard it too." And before Cal could answer, before he could even take a single step, Harris launched into a rambling monologue that sounded memorized, rehearsed, as if he'd been delivering it to the trees for years. "The forest showed me what matters, showed me what lies underneath, what breathes beneath the roots where the dirt isn't dirt but skin, old and waiting, patient in a way men never are." Cal took a careful step forward, hands raised not in threat, but in the universal gesture of a friend begging for clarity. But Harris continued, speaking over him in a cadence that wavered between prophecy and mania, insisting that something ancient moved beneath the forest floor, something that whispered to him from the soil, from the hollowed trunks, from the windless spaces between branches, and that he had been chosen. "Not saved," he corrected sharply, jabbing a finger at the ground. "Chosen because I listen, because I understand the silence must be protected or everything breaks." Rook barked then, one sharp warning snap of sound. But he didn't lunge, didn't step forward, only stayed glued to Cal's side with a posture that told Cal the dog was torn between loyalty and fear, sensing danger but knowing instinctively that this was a different kind of threat, one not governed by teeth or claws, but by the mind unraveling in front of them. Harris flinched at the bark, then laughed, a thin, papery sound that didn't belong to the man Cal had known, and lifted his hands to his ears, as though trying to block out a noise only he could hear, muttering about how loud the world was now, how the forest had given him silence so complete it carved truth into him, how returning to noise felt like drowning. Cal stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under him, and said Harris's name again, softer this time, gentle as he had once spoken to wounded soldiers in the desert. But Harris only tilted his head like he was listening to something behind Cal, something just over his shoulder, and whispered, "It's waking up, you know. It knows you've come." And in that instant, Cal felt the weight of every tree pressing in, not physically, but with a presence that made the cabin seem smaller, the air thicker, the shadows more deliberate, and he realized with terrible clarity that whatever had taken hold of Harris had not loosened its grip. Not for 20 years, not even now. And that saving him would mean facing something neither of them had words for. Harris moved with the quiet conviction of a man who had long ago stopped fearing consequences, his emaciated hand reaching into a rusted tin can to pull out a rag-bound torch that he lit with a single match struck against the splintered wall, and as flame hissed to life, casting wild shadows across the cabin's decrepit interior. He turned toward Cal with a grin that had no joy, no anger, only a grim satisfaction, as though this moment had always been waiting. And now that it had arrived, there was nothing left to do but surrender to it. The fire caught fast, licking up the dry timber, racing along the floorboards with an eagerness that felt alive. And Harris stood amid the rising heat like a priest before a pyre, whispering something Cal couldn't hear over the sudden roar of flame, something that might have been a prayer or a farewell or both. And without thinking, Cal lunged through the smoke, grabbing Harris's arm, bones sharp beneath skin, body feather light, and yanked him out as the fire surged upward, bursting through the roof with a sound like lungs exhaling the truth. Rook circled them in tense, tight arcs, barking as flames cracked the structure behind them, and Cal didn't stop pulling until they'd cleared the clearing, collapsing against the mossy slope just outside the cabin's reach, the heat on their backs like an accusation, like a confession, like absolution. Harris didn't struggle, didn't scream. He simply laid there, eyes wide open, watching the fire consume everything he had built in the dark, that twisted shrine of maps and bones and silence. And as the flames burned away the veil he had lived behind for decades, the forest itself seemed to shift. Cal felt it like a breath caught mid-inhale, as if the woods had been holding something in, and now, with the cabin burning, it was finally letting go. And maybe it wasn't just smoke that twisted skyward, but something unseen, something old and angry and starved, or perhaps something thankful, freed from its vessel of rot and memory, because as the final support beam groaned and collapsed in a blaze of embers, the woods changed. Not physically, but in atmosphere, in weight. The oppressive tension that had clung to Cal like wet cloth lifted, replaced by something colder, quieter, more curious than hostile. And Cal didn't know if what had died in that cabin was a madness or a god or both. But he knew without doubt that Harris hadn't been lying. Not completely. The fire had stripped more than timber and letters. It had exposed something deeper, something Cal could feel rooting through his thoughts now like tendrils searching for weakness. And as he looked at the man beside him, burnt, broken, smiling faintly like he'd just finished a long song, he couldn't help but wonder if Harris had set the fire to destroy what lived there, or to invite it fully into the open, and whether by pulling him out, Cal had saved him, or damned them all. In the weeks that followed the fire, the town held its breath like it was waiting for a second impact that never came, a tension that coiled into whispers behind closed doors, in coffee shops and grocery store aisles, where people spoke of the strange blaze in the woods, the man who came back from the dead, the ranger who wouldn't talk. But no one ever asked too many questions. Not really, because the answers already felt too close, like they lingered in the branches outside their windows at night. The sheriff's report was vague, full of words like exposure and mental collapse, citing Cal's veteran status and Harris's long-presumed death as extenuating circumstances. And when the state investigators arrived, they came with forms and cameras and forced politeness, but their eyes didn't linger too long on the photographs or the markings left behind in the scorched clearing. They took what they needed and left quickly, as though something about the trees made them itch. Harris was taken under psychiatric custody, diagnosed with severe delusional psychosis, his statements so fragmented and strange that no facility ever kept him long, shuffling him from one institution to the next until even the paperwork started to vanish into silence. And though Cal visited once, standing on the far side of the reinforced glass, while Harris stared at a spot in the ceiling, whispering, "Not yet, not yet," he never returned. His report was filed, yes, but what he filed and what he saw were two separate things, and he left out the map with his name on it, the bones, the mention of the watcher, left them buried beneath phrases like unknown origin and possible squatters, because some truths, he realized, weren't meant for desks and stamps. They were meant for places like the woods, where silence still holds authority. Cal returned to his cabin with a stiffness in his gait and a hollow in his chest. And though he still wore the badge, he patrolled less, walked less, spoke less, and when he did walk, it was never near that place. Not because he feared it, but because it no longer felt like his to enter. Rook stayed close, more alert than before. His loyalty fused now not just by companionship, but by shared understanding, by the kind of experience that never needed to be spoken aloud. He didn't bark much anymore, just watched, always facing the woods, always listening, like he too knew the hush that followed fire wasn't peace, but patience. And in that stillness, Cal began to notice the subtle shifts, the moments where the wind didn't match the leaves, where the animals avoided certain paths, where his own footsteps echoed too long in empty air. And he realized that the thing they'd touched, the thing Harris had fed and feared and maybe worshipped, hadn't burned with the cabin. It had simply uncoiled, released, content now to wait again, because whatever lived beneath those trees didn't need to chase. It only needed to be noticed, believed in. And Cal, standing on his porch in the gray-blue light before dawn, ears tuned to the whispers that flickered through branches like voices submerged in dreams, finally accepted what he had resisted for so long. The war hadn't followed him home. The woods had always been at war with the silence, and now that he'd heard it, he could never unhear it again.